The gunshot that shattered the midnight stillness sent Matthew Donovan stumbling from his bed with his heart hammering against his ribs. And when he grabbed his rifle and burst through the back door of his ranch house in nothing but his long johns and boots, the last thing he expected to find was a trembling woman wedged between the nesting boxes and the feed barrels in his chicken coop. The hens were raising hell, squawking and flapping in the lantern light that spilled through the open doorway, and Matthew kept his rifle trained on the corner where he had spotted movement. A pale hand emerged first, then a face streaked with dirt and what looked like dried blood, and finally, the entire form of a young woman unfolded itself from the shadows with her arms raised and her green eyes wide with terror. "Do not shoot," she said, her voice hoarse and accented in a way that spoke of somewhere far from Texas. "Please, I mean no harm." Matthew lowered the rifle slightly but did not set it down. He was a cautious man by nature, had to be in Stockton, Texas in the year 1878, where trouble could find you faster than a rattlesnake strike. The woman before him looked to be in her early 20s, with dark auburn hair that hung in tangled waves around her shoulders and a dress that had once been fine, but was now torn and stained beyond recognition. "Who are you?" Matthew demanded, stepping closer with the lantern held high. "What are you doing in my chicken coop?" The woman flinched at his tone but held her ground, though her legs were shaking so badly she had to brace herself against the wooden wall. "I am sorry," she whispered, and tears began to track clean lines through the grime on her cheeks. "I am so sorry. I had nowhere else to go." Something in her voice made Matthew's anger evaporate like morning dew under the Texas sun. He had been raised by a mother who taught him that a man's character was measured by how he treated those weaker than himself, and this woman was clearly at the end of her rope. He set the rifle down carefully and held up both hands to show he meant no harm. "You are welcome," he said, the words coming out before he had fully thought them through. "I mean, you are welcome to stay until we sort this out, but I need to know what happened to you." The woman's knees buckled then, and Matthew lunged forward to catch her before she hit the ground. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, as if she had not eaten in days, and when he lifted her, she let out a small whimper of pain. He carried her out of the chicken coop and across the yard to his house, kicking the door open with his boot and laying her gently on the sofa in his front room. "Wait here," he said unnecessarily, since she did not look capable of going anywhere. He lit the oil lamps throughout the room and stoked the fire in the hearth, then filled a basin with water from the pump and gathered clean cloths from the cupboard. When he returned to her side, she was watching him with those luminous green eyes, and he felt something shift in his chest that he could not quite name. "Let me see where you are hurt," Matthew said, his voice gentler now. The woman hesitated, then slowly pulled back the sleeve of her dress to reveal an angry gash running along her forearm. It was not deep enough to be life-threatening, but it needed attention, and Matthew set to work cleaning the wound with steady hands. He had doctored plenty of injuries on the ranch, both human and animal, and he worked with quiet efficiency while the woman bit her lip against the pain. "My name is Evelyn Zimmerman," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I came here from Pennsylvania 6 months ago with my uncle. He had business interests in Texas, or so he claimed." Matthew dipped the cloth in the water again, watching the blood swirl and dissipate. "Where is your uncle now?" Evelyn's face crumpled. "Dead. Murdered 3 days ago by the men he owed money to. They came to our hotel room in the middle of the night, and I hid under the bed while they shot him. After they left, I ran. I have been running ever since." The story came out in fits and starts while Matthew bandaged her arm, and with each detail his jaw grew tighter. Her uncle had been a gambler and a cheat, it seemed, and had gotten himself involved with some dangerous men who operated out of the saloons in Stockton. When he could not pay his debts, they had made an example of him, and now they were looking for Evelyn because they believed her uncle had hidden money or valuables somewhere, and that she knew where to find them. "I do not know anything about any money," Evelyn said, her voice breaking. "My uncle barely told me anything. He just dragged me out here and left me alone in that hotel room day after day while he went out gambling. I have no money, nowhere to go, and nobody who will help me." Matthew finished tying off the bandage and sat back on his heels, studying her face in the firelight. She was beautiful in a delicate, Eastern way that seemed out of place in this harsh landscape, with fine features and skin that had clearly not been made for the brutal Texas sun. But there was steel underneath that fragility, he thought. She had survived 3 days on the run with dangerous men hunting her, and she had not given up. "You can stay here," he heard himself say, "at least until we figure out what to do about those men." Evelyn's eyes widened. "I could not possibly impose on you like that. You do not even know me." "I know enough," Matthew said firmly. He stood and moved to the kitchen area, pulling out bread and cheese and cold beef from the larder. "When did you last eat?" "I do not remember," Evelyn admitted, and her stomach growled loudly as if to emphasize the point. Matthew brought the food to her and watched as she fell upon it with the desperate hunger of someone who had been starving. He made coffee while she ate, strong and black the way he liked it, and poured her a cup with plenty of sugar to help restore her strength. While she ate and drank, Matthew studied her more carefully. She had an education, that much was clear from the way she spoke, and good manners despite her current circumstances. Her dress, though ruined now, had been expensive once, and she wore a small gold locket around her neck that looked like a family heirloom. Whatever her uncle had been, she was not cut from the same cloth. "Tell me about these men who are after you," Matthew said, settling into the chair across from her. "What do they look like? How many are there?" Evelyn wrapped her hands around the coffee cup as if trying to draw warmth from it, though the night was not particularly cold. "There are 3 of them that I know of. The leader is a man named Silas Crane. He owns the Silver Dollar Saloon in town, but everyone knows his real business is gambling and loan sharking. The other 2 are his enforcers, big men with guns who do whatever he tells them." Matthew knew of Silas Crane by reputation, though he had never had dealings with the man himself. Crane was exactly the kind of vulture who preyed on desperate people, and Matthew felt his dislike of the man harden into something stronger. The fact that Crane and his men were hunting this frightened young woman made his blood boil in a way that surprised him. "You will be safe here," he said with conviction. "My ranch is 5 miles outside of town, and not many people come out this way without invitation. Tomorrow I will ride into Stockton and see what I can learn about the situation. Maybe I can reason with Crane, make him understand that you do not have what he is looking for." Evelyn shook her head, her eyes filling with tears again. "You do not understand what kind of man he is. He will not listen to reason, and I cannot let you put yourself in danger for me. You have already done more than anyone could expect." "I am not afraid of Silas Crane," Matthew said, and it was true. He was not a violent man by nature, but he had grown up in this hard country and knew how to handle himself when necessary. More importantly, he could not stand by and do nothing while this woman was hunted like an animal for crimes she had not committed. Evelyn studied him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face as if trying to understand what manner of man would help a complete stranger. Matthew met her gaze steadily, and something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went beyond words. She nodded slowly, accepting his help, and some of the tension went out of her shoulders. "You should rest," Matthew said, standing. You can take my bed. I will sleep out here on the sofa. I cannot take your bed, Evelyn protested, but Matthew waved away her objections. You are injured and exhausted. I will not hear another word about it. He helped her to her feet and guided her to the bedroom, which was sparse but clean, with a sturdy bed covered in quilts his mother had made before she passed. Evelyn sank onto the mattress with a sigh that seemed to come from her very soul, and Matthew pulled the quilts up over her. Thank you, she whispered, her eyes already closing. I do not even know your name. Matthew Donovan, he said quietly, and you do not need to thank me. Just rest. He left her there and returned to the front room, banking the fire and settling himself on the sofa with a blanket. But sleep was a long time coming. His mind kept turning over everything Evelyn had told him, trying to work out the best way to handle the situation. He could not just hand her over to Crane, that was unthinkable, but he also could not keep her hidden forever. Sooner or later, someone would find out she was here, and then there would be trouble. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky pink and gold when Matthew finally dozed off, and he woke a few hours later to the smell of coffee brewing. He sat up quickly, disoriented for a moment, then remembered the events of the previous night. He could hear movement in the kitchen, and when he padded over in his bare feet, he found Evelyn standing at the stove, wearing one of his shirts over her ruined dress and trying to figure out his coffee pot. You should be resting, he said, and she jumped at the sound of his voice. I wanted to make myself useful, she said, turning to face him. In the morning light, with her face cleaned of dirt and blood, she was even more beautiful than he had realized, and Matthew felt that strange sensation in his chest again. You have been so kind to me. The least I can do is make you breakfast. You do not owe me anything, Matthew said, but he did not have the heart to send her back to bed when she was clearly determined to help. Instead, he showed her where he kept the eggs and bacon, and together they prepared a simple meal while the morning light streamed through the windows. It felt oddly domestic, cooking alongside her, and Matthew found himself wondering what it would be like to have this every morning, to have someone to share his life with in this lonely place. He pushed the thought away as quickly as it had come. Evelyn was a woman in trouble, nothing more, and he was just doing what any decent man would do. Still, he could not help but notice the way her hair caught the light, or the graceful way she moved around his kitchen, or the sound of her soft laughter when he told her a story about one of his chickens. After breakfast, Matthew saddled his horse and prepared to ride into Stockton. Evelyn watched from the porch, her arms wrapped around herself despite the warmth of the morning, and her face was tight with worry. Be careful, she said as he swung up into the saddle. Silas Crane is not a man to be trifled with. I will be careful, Matthew promised. Stay inside and keep the doors locked. I will be back before dark. The ride into town gave him time to think, to plan what he would say and how he would approach the situation. Stockton was a growing town in the heart of Texas cattle country, with a main street lined with wooden buildings and false fronts that tried to give the place an air of permanence it did not quite possess. The Silver Dollar Saloon sat in the middle of the street like a spider at the center of its web, and Matthew tied his horse to the rail outside with a sense of grim determination. The saloon was quiet at this hour, with only a few early drinkers nursing their whiskey in the dim interior. Matthew's eyes took a moment to adjust to the gloom, and then he spotted Silas Crane sitting at a corner table with a deck of cards spread before him. Crane was a small man with sharp features and cold eyes, dressed in a fancy suit that looked out of place in this rough country. Well, well, Crane said as Matthew approached. Matthew Donovan, is it not? I have heard of you, the rancher who keeps to himself out beyond the town limits. What brings you to my establishment? Matthew pulled out a chair and sat down without being invited. "I heard you are looking for a woman." "Evelyn Zimmerman, I want to talk to you about that." Crane's eyes narrowed. "What business is that of yours?" "She came to me for help," Matthew said evenly. "She told me about her uncle and what happened to him. She says she does not know anything about any hidden money." "And you believe her?" Crane laughed, a thin, unpleasant sound. How touching, the brave cowboy rushing to defend the damsel in distress. "But I am afraid this does not concern you, Donovan. The girl's uncle owed me $10,000. That debt does not just disappear because he is dead." "She is not responsible for her uncle's debts," Matthew said, fighting to keep his voice calm. "She is innocent in all of this." Crane leaned back in his chair and lit a cigar, studying Matthew through the smoke. "Perhaps she is. But I have reason to believe her uncle gave her something before he died, something valuable, and I intend to get it back one way or another." "There is nothing to get back," Matthew insisted. "The man was a gambler who lost everything. If he had $10,000 hidden away, do you really think he would have owed you money in the first place?" "That is what I intend to find out," Crane said, his voice hardening. "Now I suggest you tell me where the girl is, and we can all avoid any unpleasantness." Matthew stood slowly, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "I am not telling you anything, and if you or your men come near my property, you will regret it." Crane's face darkened. "You are making a very big mistake, Donovan. I have ways of dealing with people who interfere with my business." "Try me," Matthew said, holding the other man's gaze until Crane looked away. Then he turned and walked out of the saloon, his heart pounding but his head held high. He had made an enemy today, he knew, but he could not bring himself to regret it. Some things were worth standing up for, and Evelyn's safety was one of them. He stopped at the general store to pick up supplies, and while the clerk was wrapping his purchases, he heard two women talking near the fabric section. They were discussing the murder at the hotel, and how poor Evelyn Zimmerman had disappeared without a trace. One of them speculated that she had probably run off with whatever money her uncle had stolen, while the other expressed sympathy for the poor girl who had been dragged into such a terrible situation. Matthew paid for his supplies and rode back to the ranch, his mind working on a plan. He could not keep Evelyn hidden forever, but he needed time to figure out how to permanently solve the problem of Silas Crane. Perhaps he could find evidence that her uncle truly had no hidden money. Or perhaps he could convince the authorities to step in and deal with Crane's illegal activities. The town had a sheriff, though rumor had it that the man was in Crane's pocket. When he arrived back at the ranch, Evelyn rushed out to meet him, and the relief on her face when she saw him safe made something warm bloom in his chest. She helped him carry the supplies inside, and while he unpacked them, she told him that she had spent the day cleaning his house and tending to his chickens, trying to make herself useful. "You did not have to do that," Matthew said, though he was touched by the gesture. His house had not been truly clean since his mother died 2 years ago, and it felt good to see it looking like a home again. "I wanted to," Evelyn said simply. "You have given me so much. Please let me do something in return." Over the next few days, they fell into a comfortable routine. Matthew worked the ranch during the day, tending to his cattle and horses and the various repairs that always needed doing, while Evelyn kept the house and prepared their meals. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sunset paint the sky in shades of crimson and gold, talking about their lives and their dreams. Matthew learned that Evelyn had been a teacher back in Pennsylvania, that she loved books and music, and had always dreamed of seeing the West. Her uncle had promised her adventure when he convinced her to come with him to Texas, but the reality had been nothing like she imagined. She had been lonely and frightened, trapped in a hotel room with a man who saw her as nothing more than a burden. In turn, Matthew told her about growing up on this ranch, about his parents who had carved a life out of this harsh land, and about the loneliness he had felt since they passed. He had always been too busy with the work of keeping the ranch running to think about finding a wife, and most of the women in Stockton were already spoken for, or had no interest in the hard life of a rancher's wife. As the days turned into a week, Matthew found himself looking forward to the end of each day, when he could return to the house and find Evelyn waiting for him with dinner ready, and a smile on her face. He noticed little things about her, the way she hummed while she worked, the way her nose crinkled when she laughed, the way she listened to his stories with genuine interest. And he saw the way she looked at him sometimes, with an expression he did not quite dare to interpret. One evening, about 10 days after she had appeared in his chicken coop, they were sitting on the porch as usual when Evelyn suddenly reached over and took his hand. Matthew froze, startled by the contact, and looked down at their intertwined fingers. "I need to tell you something," Evelyn said softly. "I have been thinking about this for days, trying to find the right words." Matthew's heart began to pound. "What is it?" "I know I cannot stay here forever," she said, and there was sadness in her voice. "It is not fair to you, and eventually Crane will find out where I am. But I want you to know that these past days have been the happiest I have had in a very long time. You have shown me what it means to be truly safe, truly cared for, and I have come to care for you very much." Matthew turned to face her fully, his hand still holding hers. "I care for you too," he said, the words feeling inadequate to express the depth of what he felt. "More than I probably should, given the circumstances." Evelyn smiled then, a real smile that lit up her whole face. "There is no should about it. The heart wants what it wants, regardless of circumstances." "What are you saying?" Matthew asked, afraid to hope. "I am saying that if things were different, if I were not running for my life, I would want to stay here with you. I would want to build a life here on this ranch by your side." Matthew felt as if his heart might burst out of his chest. "Then let us make things different. Let me protect you from Crane. Let me find a way to end this threat so you can stay." "How?" Evelyn asked, and there was longing in her voice. "How can we possibly fight a man like that?" "I do not know yet," Matthew admitted, "but I will find a way, I promise you." They sat there in the growing darkness, hands clasped, and made quiet plans for a future that seemed impossibly far away. But the hope between them was real and tangible, and it gave them both the strength to face whatever was coming. The next morning, Matthew was mending a fence in the north pasture when he saw dust rising on the road from town. 3 riders were approaching fast, and even from a distance he could tell they meant trouble. He dropped his tools and ran for the house, his blood turning to ice in his veins. "Evelyn," he shouted as he burst through the door, "we have company coming. Get to the root cellar now." Evelyn did not waste time asking questions. She had been living with the fear of discovery for too long, and her instincts were sharp. She grabbed the trapdoor in the kitchen floor and disappeared down into the darkness while Matthew repositioned the rug over it. Then he grabbed his rifle and stepped out onto the porch just as the 3 riders came to a stop in his yard. Silas Crane sat in the middle, flanked by 2 large men with guns on their hips and mean expressions on their faces. Crane smiled at Matthew, but there was no warmth in it. "Good morning, Donovan," Crane said pleasantly. "Lovely day, is it not?" "What do you want, Crane?" Matthew asked, the rifle held loosely but ready. "Just paying a friendly visit," Crane said. "I was in the area and thought I would stop by and see how you are doing." "You live out here all alone, do you not? Must get lonely." "I manage just fine," Matthew said coldly. "Now, if you have said what you came to say, I have work to do." Crane's smile widened. "Not very hospitable, are you?" Here I am, offering you friendship, and you treat me like an enemy. But then again, perhaps you have reason to be suspicious. Perhaps you have something to hide. I have nothing to hide from you or anyone else, Matthew lied smoothly. Now get off my property. One of Crane's men shifted in his saddle, his hand moving toward his gun, but Crane held up a hand to stop him. Easy, boys. Mr. Donovan is just being cautious. Can't blame a man for that. He turned his cold eyes back to Matthew. But I should warn you, Donovan. I have ways of finding out when people are lying to me, and I do not take kindly to being lied to. Then it is a good thing I am telling you the truth, Matthew said. Now leave. For a long moment, Crane just stared at him, and Matthew could feel the weight of that gaze like a physical thing. Then Crane nodded slowly and turned his horse. We will be seeing you again, Donovan. Real soon. The three men rode off, and Matthew stood on the porch until they were out of sight, his hands shaking with adrenaline. He waited another 10 minutes to be sure they were truly gone, then went back inside and opened the trapdoor. Evelyn climbed out, her face pale but composed. He knows, she said quietly. He knows I am here. He suspects, Matthew corrected, but he does not have proof. And he will not get any if I have anything to say about it. But they both knew the situation had changed. Crane was closing in, and it was only a matter of time before he made his move. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. That afternoon, Matthew rode into town again, this time to visit Sheriff Tom Hargrove. The sheriff's office was a small building near the jail, and Hargrove was sitting at his desk doing paperwork when Matthew walked in. He was a portly man in his 50s with graying hair and a tired expression. "Afternoon, Sheriff," Matthew said. "I need to talk to you about Silas Crane." Hargrove's expression became guarded. "What about him? He is threatening an innocent woman, and I want you to do something about it." The sheriff sighed and set down his pen. "Look, Donovan, I know Crane is not the most upstanding citizen, but unless you have proof that he has broken the law, there is nothing I can do." "He murdered a man," Matthew said, his frustration boiling over. "He shot Evelyn Zimmerman's uncle in cold blood because of a gambling debt." "Can you prove that?" Hargrove asked. "Were there witnesses? Evidence?" Matthew deflated. "No, but everyone knows what kind of man he is." "Knowing and proving are two different things," Hargrove said, not unkindly. "My advice to you is to stay away from Crane and his business. Nothing good comes from getting involved with men like that." Matthew left the sheriff's office feeling defeated. The law was not going to help them, which meant they were on their own. He was running out of options, and he knew Crane would not wait much longer before making another move. When he got back to the ranch, he found Evelyn sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper in front of her, writing something with intense concentration. She looked up when he entered, and there was determination in her eyes. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what my uncle might have left behind. There was one thing, something I did not think was important at the time." "What is it?" Matthew asked, sitting down across from her. "A week before he died, my uncle gave me a letter. He said it was just some business correspondence he wanted me to keep safe, nothing important. But what if it was more than that? What if it contains information about where he hid something valuable?" "Do you still have it?" Matthew asked, his heart beginning to race. Evelyn nodded. "It was in my pocket when I ran. I have it in the bedroom with my other things." She went to fetch it, and when she returned, she handed Matthew a creased envelope with her name written on the front in a shaky hand. Matthew opened it carefully and pulled out a single sheet of paper covered in cramped writing. It appeared to be some kind of list, with names and numbers that did not make immediate sense. But as he studied it more carefully, he began to see a pattern. These were not just random notes. They were records of payments, debts, and transactions, all involving Silas Crane and several other prominent men in Stockton. "This is not just business correspondence," Matthew said slowly. "This is evidence. Your uncle was keeping records of Crane's illegal activities. If this information got out, it could destroy him." Evelyn's eyes widened. "Do you think that is what Crane is really after? Not money, but this letter?" "It makes sense," Matthew said, his mind racing. "If your uncle threatened to expose Crane unless his debts were forgiven, that would give Crane a reason to kill him. And if Crane thinks you have this letter, he will stop at nothing to get it back." They stared at each other across the table, both understanding the implications. This letter was their leverage, but it was also incredibly dangerous. If they tried to use it against Crane, they would be putting themselves in even greater danger. But if they did nothing, Crane would eventually find them, and then the letter would not matter anyway. "We need to make copies," Matthew said decisively. "Multiple copies hidden in different places. Then we need to let Crane know that if anything happens to either of us, those copies will be sent to the authorities and the newspapers." "Will that be enough to stop him?" Evelyn asked doubtfully. "It will have to be," Matthew said, "because I do not see any other option." They spent the rest of the evening making careful copies of the letter by lamplight. Matthew's handwriting was not as neat as Evelyn's, but between them they produced 3 perfect duplicates. The next morning, Matthew rode into town with 1 copy hidden in his boot and another in his saddlebag. The third, along with the original, remained hidden at the ranch. He went first to the office of the Stockton Herald, the town's weekly newspaper. The editor, a man named Jonathan Marks, was known for his integrity and his willingness to print stories that made the powerful uncomfortable. Matthew told him about Evelyn's situation, leaving out her current location, and showed him 1 copy of the letter. Mark studied it carefully, his expression growing more serious with each line. "This is explosive," he said finally. "If even half of what is recorded here is true, it implicates some of the most powerful men in this county." "Will you publish it?" Matthew asked. "Not yet," Mark said, and Matthew's heart sank. But then the editor continued, "But I will hold on to this copy and keep it safe. And if anything happens to you or Miss Zimmerman, I will publish every word of it on the front page. You have my word on that." Matthew left the newspaper office feeling somewhat better. At least now there was insurance, a guarantee that Crane could not simply make them disappear without consequences. He left the other copy with his lawyer, a crusty old man named Harrison who had handled his parents' estate and who could be trusted to follow instructions. When he returned to the ranch that afternoon, he found Evelyn pacing nervously on the porch. She ran to him as he dismounted, and he caught her in his arms, feeling the trembling of her body against his. "I was so worried," she whispered into his chest. "I thought something might have happened to you." "I am fine," Matthew assured her, stroking her hair. "Everything is in place. Now we just need to deliver our message to Crane." But before they could make their move, Crane made his. That night, Matthew woke to the smell of smoke. He jumped out of bed and rushed to the window, and his blood turned to ice. The barn was on fire, flames licking up the sides of the wooden structure and lighting up the night sky like hellfire. "Evelyn," he shouted, running to wake her. She stumbled out of the bedroom, disoriented with sleep, and Matthew grabbed her hand. "We need to go. Now." They could hear men's voices outside, laughing and shouting, and Matthew knew this was Crane's doing. This was meant to flush them out, to force them into the open where they could be caught. He grabbed his gun and led Evelyn to the back door, praying that whoever was out there had not thought to cover all the exits. They slipped out into the darkness, staying low and moving as quietly as possible. The fire cast dancing shadows everywhere, making it hard to see, but Matthew knew every inch of his land. He led Evelyn away from the house, toward the dense copse of trees that bordered his property to the east. Behind them, they could hear more shouting, and then gunshots as their absence was discovered. They ran through the darkness, branches whipping at their faces and roots threatening to trip them with every step. Matthew held tight to Evelyn's hand, pulling her along when she stumbled, never letting go. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, and Matthew knew they had to find a place to hide. There was an old line shack about a mile from the house, used by his father when the ranch had run more cattle. It was barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but it would have to do. They reached it just as the eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the approaching dawn, and Matthew pulled Evelyn inside and barred the door with a piece of timber. They collapsed onto the dirt floor, both gasping for breath. Matthew checked his gun, counting bullets, and then moved to the single window to peer out into the growing light. He could see smoke still rising from the direction of his ranch, a black column against the pink sky, and his heart ached for everything he was losing. "I am so sorry," Evelyn sobbed beside him. "This is all my fault. Your home, your animals, everything is being destroyed because of me." Matthew turned away from the window and pulled her into his arms. "This is not your fault. This is Crane's doing and his alone. And he is going to pay for it, I promise you that." They sat there holding each other as the sun rose, both knowing that they could not hide in this shack forever. Eventually, Crane's men would find them, and then what? Matthew's mind worked frantically, trying to come up with a plan, anything that would get them out of this situation alive. By mid-morning, they heard horses approaching. Matthew positioned himself by the window with his rifle ready, prepared to make a stand if necessary. But to his surprise, it was not Crane's men who appeared. It was Sheriff Hargrove, along with a posse of about 10 men from town. "Donovan," the sheriff called out, "are you in there? It is Sheriff Hargrove. We are here to help." Matthew exchanged a glance with Evelyn, not sure if they could trust this, but having little choice. He unbarred the door and stepped out cautiously, his rifle still in hand. "What is going on, Sheriff?" he asked. Hargrove dismounted and approached with his hands visible, showing he meant no threat. "Jonathan Marks came to me early this morning with a copy of that letter you showed him, said I needed to see it right away. After I read it, I gathered some men I trust and rode out here. Looks like we were right to hurry. Crane burned down my barn," Matthew said, gesturing toward the smoke. "He and his men chased us here. They are probably still out there looking for us." "Not anymore," Hargrove said grimly. "We caught 3 of them on the road. They are in custody now and they are talking. Seems Crane promised them money to get rid of you and the girl, but with what is in that letter, plus their testimony, I have enough to arrest Crane and shut down his whole operation." Matthew felt weak with relief. "So it is over." "It is over," Hargrove confirmed. "You and Miss Zimmerman are safe. Crane will hang for murder and his associates will face justice too." Evelyn had come to stand beside Matthew, and now she took his hand. "What about the ranch?" she asked quietly. "The house is still standing," Hargrove said. "The barn is a total loss, and you lost some livestock, but it could have been much worse. You have friends in town, Donovan. People will help you rebuild." Over the next few weeks, that prediction proved true. Matthew had always kept to himself, but now he discovered that he was more valued in the community than he had realized. Men came from all over the county to help rebuild his barn, bringing lumber and nails and labor. Women brought food and supplies, and several even brought chickens to replace the ones that had been killed in the fire. Through it all, Evelyn was by his side, working as hard as anyone. She proved to be stronger than her delicate appearance suggested, hauling water and preparing meals for the work crews and doing whatever else needed doing. and Matthew fell more in love with her with each passing day. One evening, after the last of the workers had left, and they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, Matthew turned to her and took her hand. "Evelyn," he said, his voice suddenly nervous. "These past weeks have shown me something I should have realized sooner. I do not want to live without you. I do not want to go back to being alone in this house, living half a life. I want you here always. Will you marry me?" Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears this time. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married a month later in the little church in Stockton, with half the town in attendance. It was a simple ceremony, but to Matthew, it felt like the most important moment of his life. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Matthew kissed his bride for the first time, he felt as if his life was finally complete. The months that followed were the happiest either of them had ever known. Evelyn transformed the ranch house into a real home, filling it with curtains and cushions and small touches that made it warm and welcoming. She started a vegetable garden and convinced Matthew to build her a proper chicken coop, one that was larger and better designed than the old one where she had first hidden. "I have a soft spot for chicken coops now," she told him with a smile. "After all, that is where my new life began." Matthew worked harder than ever to make the ranch prosper, driven by the desire to give Evelyn the life she deserved. He added more cattle to his herd and bought several breeding horses, and slowly but surely, the ranch began to turn a real profit. Evelyn helped with the bookkeeping, her education and sharp mind proving invaluable in managing the business side of things. They made regular trips into Stockton, where Evelyn was welcomed warmly by the community. She started a small school for the children of ranchers and farmers who lived too far from town to attend regular classes, teaching them reading and writing and arithmetic in a corner of the church, 3 days a week. The children adored her, and Matthew loved watching her with them, seeing the patience and kindness she showed to even the most difficult students. A year after their wedding, Evelyn came to Matthew with news that made his heart soar. She was expecting a child. Matthew was beside himself with joy, already imagining a son or daughter to carry on the ranch after him. He became ridiculously protective of Evelyn, trying to prevent her from doing any heavy work, though she laughingly told him she was pregnant, not made of glass. Their son was born on a warm spring morning in 1880, a healthy baby with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. They named him William, after Matthew's father, and Matthew held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by the love he felt for this tiny person. Evelyn proved to be a natural mother, patient and loving but also firm when needed. Matthew discovered that he loved being a father, loved coming in from the fields to find his wife nursing their son or singing lullabies to him. The house that had once felt empty and cold was now full of life and laughter. When William was 2 years old, they had a daughter, whom they named Caroline after Evelyn's mother. She had auburn hair like Evelyn and a sweet disposition that charmed everyone she met. Matthew built an addition onto the house to give the children their own rooms, and Evelyn filled those rooms with handmade quilts and toys carved by Matthew during the long winter evenings. The years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. The ranch continued to prosper, becoming one of the most successful in the county. Matthew hired a few ranch hands to help with the work, good men who became like family. Evelyn's school grew until they had to build a proper schoolhouse, and she became known throughout the region as an excellent teacher. Silas Crane had been hanged for murder, and his criminal empire had crumbled. Stockton became a more law-abiding place, and new businesses opened, bringing prosperity to the region. Matthew and Evelyn became pillars of the community, respected and well-liked. When their children were older, Matthew and Evelyn would sometimes sit on the porch in the evenings and marvel at how far they had come from that terrifying night when she had hidden in his chicken coop. It seemed like another lifetime, something that had happened to different people. "Do you ever regret it?" Matthew asked her one evening. "Leaving Pennsylvania, coming west, everything you went through." Evelyn leaned against his shoulder, watching their children play in the yard. William was 8 now and teaching Caroline how to rope a fence post. "Not for a single moment," she said softly. "Yes, I went through terrible things, but those things led me to you, to this life, to our children. I would go through it all again if I had to." Matthew kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "I found you in a chicken coop and you apologized. I told you that you were welcome. Little did I know you would become my whole world. Little did I know I would find my home in the middle of nowhere, Texas," Evelyn replied with a smile. "But that is exactly what happened. This ranch, this life with you, our children, this is home. This is where I was always meant to be." As the sun set over the Texas landscape, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Matthew held his wife close and counted his blessings. He had started with a small ranch and a lonely life, and now he had everything a man could want. A loving wife, healthy children, a successful business, and a place in a thriving community. The years continued to roll by with the steady rhythm of ranch life. William grew into a strong young man who loved the land as much as his father did, and Matthew began teaching him everything he knew about running the ranch. Caroline showed her mother's love of learning and became an excellent student, already talking about becoming a teacher herself someday. When William turned 18, Matthew officially made him a partner in the ranch, and the pride he felt watching his son take on more responsibility was almost overwhelming. William had his father's steady nature and his mother's quick mind, and Matthew knew the ranch would be in good hands when he was gone. They had 2 more children over the years, another son named James and a daughter named Sarah. The house that had once held only Matthew now rang with the sounds of a large family, with grandchildren eventually added to the mix when William married a nice girl from town and started his own family. Evelyn continued teaching until she was well into her 50s, finally retiring when the school board insisted on hiring a younger teacher who could keep up with the growing number of students. But she never stopped learning herself, always had a book in her hands, and she passed that love of knowledge on to all their children and grandchildren. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Matthew took Evelyn back to the chicken coop, which still stood though it had been rebuilt and improved over the years. They stood there in the evening light, and Matthew put his arms around his wife from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "25 years ago," he said quietly, "I found a frightened woman hiding among my chickens. She said she was sorry, and I told her she was welcome. Best decision I ever made." Evelyn turned in his arms to face him, her face lined now with age but still beautiful to him, her green eyes still bright and full of life. "Best decision I ever made was to hide in this chicken coop. Of all the places I could have ended up that night, fate led me here to you. I will never stop being grateful for that." They kissed there in the chicken coop, surrounded by the soft clucking of hens and the smell of hay, and it felt just as magical as their first kiss had 25 years before. Love, Matthew reflected, did not fade with time. It grew deeper, richer, more complex, like a tree putting down roots and spreading branches. As they grew older together, Matthew and Evelyn became the beloved patriarch and matriarch of not just their own family but of the entire community. Their home was always open, their table always welcoming to anyone who needed a meal or advice or just a friendly ear. They had lived through hard times and good times, had weathered storms both literal and figurative, and their love had only grown stronger. Matthew often thought about that night, about the choices he had made. He could have turned Evelyn away, could have told her to hide somewhere else, could have decided that her problems were not his concern. But instead, he had offered her sanctuary, and in doing so, had found the other half of his soul. When Matthew was in his 70s and his hands had grown too stiff to do much of the ranch work anymore, he and Evelyn would sit on the porch for hours, watching their children and grandchildren work the land they had built together. William ran the ranch now, with help from James and their sons, and they had expanded it into one of the largest and most successful operations in Texas. Caroline had indeed become a teacher, taking over the school her mother had founded, and Sarah had married a doctor and moved to Houston but visited often with her own children. The family Matthew and Evelyn had created together had spread roots throughout Texas, and their descendants would carry on their legacy for generations to come. On a warm summer evening in 1920, Matthew sat on the porch with Evelyn beside him, holding her hand as they had done countless times before. They were both old now, their hair white, their bodies frail, but their love was as strong as ever. Around them, 3 generations of their family had gathered for a reunion, and the sound of laughter and conversation filled the air. "Did you ever imagine it would be like this?" Evelyn asked softly, watching their youngest great-grandchild toddle across the yard. "When you found me in that chicken coop all those years ago," Matthew squeezed her hand gently. "No," he admitted. "I could never have imagined anything this wonderful. You gave me everything, Evelyn. A family, a purpose, a reason to build something that would last. You made my life complete." "We made it together," Evelyn corrected gently. "Everything we built side by side. That is what marriage is supposed to be, partners in everything." They sat there in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar colors. Matthew thought about all the years they had shared, all the joys and sorrows, the triumphs and challenges. It had been a good life, a full life, exactly the kind of life he had always dreamed of but never thought he would have. When the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, their children came to help them inside, and Matthew and Evelyn went willingly, content in the knowledge that they had lived well and loved deeply. They had faced danger together, built a home together, raised children together, and grown old together. As Matthew helped Evelyn into bed that night, as he had done for over 40 years, he kissed her forehead and whispered, "Thank you for hiding in my chicken coop." Evelyn laughed, the same musical laugh that had captivated him decades ago. "Thank you for telling me I was welcome. Thank you for giving me a home, a family, a life beyond anything I could have dreamed. Thank you for loving me." "That," Matthew said, settling into bed beside her and taking her hand, "was the easiest thing I have ever done." They drifted off to sleep together, as they had done every night for over 4 decades, with their hands still clasped and their hearts still beating in the same rhythm. And if anyone had asked them whether they would change anything about their lives, about the path that had led a frightened woman to hide in a chicken coop and a lonely cowboy to offer her sanctuary, they would have said no without hesitation. Because from that chance encounter, from that simple exchange of apology and welcome, had grown something rare and precious. A love that had weathered every storm, overcome every obstacle, and built a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. A love that had started in the most unlikely of places and had bloomed into something beautiful and lasting. Their children and grandchildren would tell the story for years to come, of how grandmother had hidden in grandfather's chicken coop and how he had welcomed her in, and how from that night had sprung an entire family, an entire life. It would become the family legend, the founding myth of the Donovan clan, told and retold at gatherings and reunions. And years later, when Matthew and Evelyn had both passed peacefully in their sleep within days of each other, their family would gather at the ranch to remember them. They would stand by the old chicken coop, which had been preserved as a sort of monument to where it all began, and they would marvel at how a single night of fear and courage had led to so much love and life. The ranch continued to thrive under William's management, and eventually his son's management. The family Matthew and Evelyn had started together grew and prospered, spreading throughout Texas and beyond. Teachers, ranchers, doctors, lawyers, every generation produced new branches on the family tree, but they all traced their roots back to that ranch outside Stockton, to the cowboy and the frightened woman who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. The story of Matthew and Evelyn became one of those romantic legends that people love to hear, proof that true love can bloom even in the darkest of times, that courage and kindness are always rewarded, and that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. Children would ask their parents to tell them again about how great-great-grandmother Evelyn hid in the chicken coop, and how great-great-grandfather Matthew found her there. And the story would be told once more, keeping their memory alive. In the end, what had started with a simple apology and an even simpler welcome had created a love story for the ages, one that would be remembered and cherished long after everyone who had known Matthew and Evelyn personally had passed away. Their love had been tested by danger and hardship, but it had emerged stronger and more beautiful for it. They had built not just a home and a family, but a legacy of love that would endure for generations. And perhaps that is the greatest testament to the power of love, that it can start in the most humble of places, like a chicken coop on a Texas ranch, and grow into something that touches countless lives and echoes through time. Matthew and Evelyn had found each other when both were lost, had built a life together from nothing, and had created something that would last forever. Their great-great-grandchildren would eventually restore the old chicken coop, turning it into a historical landmark that tourists would visit, wanting to see the place where this great love story had begun. A plaque would be mounted outside, telling the story of the cowboy who found a woman hiding in his chicken coop, of how she apologized and he told her she was welcome, and of how that simple exchange had led to a lifetime of love and happiness. But those who knew the full story, who had heard it passed down through the generations, understood that it was not just about a chance encounter. It was about the choice Matthew made that night to help someone in need, about Evelyn's courage to trust a stranger when she had every reason to trust no one. It was about two people who found each other at exactly the right moment, who chose love over fear, hope over despair, and who built something beautiful together. The Texas landscape changed over the decades, but the Donovan Ranch remained, a testament to everything Matthew and Evelyn had built. The house they had filled with love and laughter still stood, carefully maintained by generations of their descendants. The land they had worked so hard to cultivate continued to produce, supporting new generations of the family. And every sunset, when the sky turned gold and crimson over the Texas plains, anyone standing on the porch of that old ranch house could almost feel their presence, could almost see Matthew and Evelyn sitting there hand in hand, watching the day end and counting their blessings. Their love had become part of the land itself, woven into the very fabric of the place they had called home. This was their legacy, greater than any amount of land or money they could have left behind. They had shown everyone who came after them what true love looked like, what it meant to stand by someone through thick and thin, to build a life together one day at a time, to choose each other over and over again. And that lesson, that example, would be passed down from generation to generation, keeping their love alive forever. The story of Matthew and Evelyn proved that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the smallest actions, that heroism can be as simple as offering shelter to someone in need, and that love can find us in the most unexpected places. All it takes is an open heart, the courage to trust, and the willingness to say to a frightened stranger hiding in your chicken coop, "You are welcome,"